Welcome, guys, to the first episode of the Wolves on North State Street podcast, and we're here with Dr. Littlejohn, who is an economics professor here at Millsaps College, and he teaches a variety of different economics fields such as microeconomics, macroeconomics, international economics, and money and financial systems. So,
Beyond the classroom, he keeps busy with research, serves as a journal referee, and speaks at academic conferences and business events. His work explores the dynamic relationship between corporate and consumer financial markets, monetary policy, and macroeconomic activity using theory and quantitative methods. Fun fact, we took macroeconomics with him as well, so he really has taught us our basics.
welcome to the show, Dr. Littlejohn.
Thanks for having me.
To kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about your journey into this field and what got you interested in this field?
Yeah, so basically it started when I was an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, which is in California. And going in as an undergrad there, I really didn't have any economic background coming from high school. So, sometimes some high schools will give you like a full year of, economics, like your senior year or something. But basically for me, I had like 1 month of economics during my senior year.
Mm-hmm.
And we just discussed like just the basics, GDP, inflation, unemployment.
The important stuff.
And I didn't really think that much about it. Now, it was high school, so, I was just doing, enough to get my grades and, and I already knew where I was going to be going for college.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so when I got to Santa Cruz, then I had to start taking classes, and I knew I was interested in like the business world, okay? But I still didn't think anything about economics yet. And my dad was an accountant, my grandpa was an accountant, so like I'm looking at these classes to take, my freshman year, and I'll start with accounting.
Okay.
And then, I kind of was thinking, hey, eventually if, I could work with my dad, take over his practice and go there. So I took one accounting class first semester or quarter for the UCs, and it was good. I did really well, and then the professor actually asked me to be an undergrad TA for some of her future classes. And so I did that, I want to say like probably the third quarter, I was an undergrad TA for accounting. And so, it was just like, I wasn't teaching like the lectures, but we'd have these little supplementary sections outside of lecture. They'd be like an hour, hour session, maybe 2 or 3 a week. And I just loved teaching. But I was still, I wasn't exactly sure what field I was going to be in. So far I was just doing accounting. So it wasn't until probably my sophomore year, I think fall my sophomore year, I took my first econ class. And that's when I started to enjoy kind of the bringing in the more subjectiveness and, less objectivity with like, a set of rules. Accounting, it's like, here's what you do, here's your debits and credits, and you follow the formula. And I got that, and it was okay. I didn't, I wasn't in love with it, but it came to me pretty well. But with economics, I just started feeling like there's so much subjectivity to this stuff. It's like we're shifting these curves, but like depending on how much you shift a curve, that's going to dictate where the new equilibrium is. Whether prices rise or output goes up and all that. So I started really enjoying that, and so that's when I started to pivot away from the accounting stuff. I maybe did 2 or 3 accounting classes. Then I started to pivot more towards econ. I did micro first, then I did macro. And when I went into macro, that's when I liked it even more. And every once in a while, I'd start hearing about like the connections between macro and the finance sector. So then I started reading some books like over the summer. This was probably my sophomore year summer, and I read a book on the 2008 financial crisis. And when it kind of took a more critical view of not really what was just going on within the private sector, but kind of how the government and the Fed was involved with kind of, creating the environment for the incentives to inflate bubbles in asset markets, right? And so kind of bringing in the government side and the controversy over like, there's one argument here, there's one argument on this side. That's when I really started to fall in love with the macro finance world. And then from there, it was all just econ. I was an econ major with, I knew my interest though was more in the macro side. And then probably junior year, I decided I wanted to also teach because I enjoyed that TAing opportunity. So I knew I wanted to teach and I wanted to do it with economics. And then that's what led me to applying for grad school.
That's actually so interesting because you said these things interested you when you were taking macroecon, and that's exactly how you taught us too, because I remember watching a movie on it, and you really shaped our class as well based on how journey went. So that's really
Was that the on the financial crisis, the inside
yes.
job? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Last semester. Oh wait, that was money and finance too, but yeah.
Yeah, but it plays everywhere.
Everywhere. So you said you enjoyed teaching. So what is your favorite part about teaching econ?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the most rewarding part of teaching is when you start to see students really get it and understand it, and then ask like for further clarification, or they start to connect it with stuff that they're familiar with.
Yeah.
So like a lot of times when we're discussing macro financial topics, or really anything that's going to involve how policies such as let's say a new tax policy, how that's going to affect the financial sector and your personal finances. I like to draw as much connection with that as in terms of what you guys are experiencing now. It can be tough for undergrads because some of you do have credit cards, but not everyone does.
Yeah.
It's a little bit easier when you get older, like for grad students. But one of the biggest things for me is that I feel like we need more financial education earlier on, like in high school. Like I said, I took it was a history class, but we spent like 1 month on economics as a senior. So when I got, when I was 18 and I got to college, I had never written a check before. I did not have a credit card. I didn't even know how credit worked. And, I knew, I'd heard about interest rates, but I didn't know the whole idea that, it's compensation for, giving your money to someone for a period of time, So, that's why I really try to focus on trying to get you guys connected with what you're experiencing right now as early as possible. And trying to think about, how does, when the central bank discusses changing interest rates, how does that actually impact you? I mean, right now, it might just be through a credit card, but, eventually it's going to, it could be through student loans, and then eventually housing and all that.
Yeah, I like how you really related it back to real world applications, like the mortgage and loans, bonds, stuff that kids our age will have to get into, later on down the road.
And it makes the studying a little bit more, a little easier, right? Yeah. When you can start to understand why it matters.
And it kind of gets more interesting because you're like if you can really dive deep into those subjects, financially you will be literate with that stuff, and you won't be running around asking different professionals hey, what should I do with this? You know yourself, you know how to evaluate and do all that. So
definitely,
it's really good. So there's been a lot of talk about a possible recession coming up, and what's your take on where the economy is going in 2025?
Yeah, so I mean, the way it works with recessions and forecasting and predicting, there's always a positive, there's always a risk of a recession at any moment, right? There's always short-term risk, and it's sometimes I'll hear in the news they'll say, well, right now there's no short-term risk of a recession. Well, there's always a positive risk. It just sometimes it's lower than other times. Now as far as what my personal opinion is, I mean, every single economist has their own subjective view of how the economy's looking. But for me, I always kind of take I say it's like the three pillars of macro. You got GDP, which is the activity. You got the unemployment rate, and that's more labor market. And then you've got the prices that's captured by, whatever you want to do, consumer price index, producer price index. So those are kind of the three pillars. But then within those categories, there's still hundreds of metrics to look at. And you can always dig deeper, So it's we think about, okay, GDP growth, I think the current rate right now is real GDP growth is 2 point something maybe for, currently annual. And it's okay, now we have different, sectors of the economy that contribute to that growth, right? You've got the consumption side, and then, you guys remember the other ones?
Consumption.
The C.
Investment,
Yep.
government spending, net exports.
And then net exports, right? Yeah. So if we were to just take out the net exports, because we know for us that's negative because we have one of the biggest trade deficits in the world. We just focus on the C to I to G, okay, your three sectors. If you look at where the growth right now is coming from, it's from consumption, and it's come the G, the government spending. Investment's actually been declining.
Really?
But see, it's a net effect, right? So you can have, categories 1 and 3 growing while category 2 is, decreasing, but it nets out to be an overall growth,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So when we start to think about this, what this could mean, well, it's like, well, consumption's good. We have to consume, we have to have an income to, be able to consume and spend.
Yeah.
But what's another way though that we could also spend? Where else could we get money if we don't generate it through income?
Oh, investments or
Interest income.
Yeah.
But that's still technically a form of
Yeah, it
income
is.
though. What else could we do though if we don't have any income?
I'd say
If you don't have any income.
Yeah, so if you don't have any income, where could you get money from? What could you do? Or someone invest in you, right? Borrow.
Okay.
You
Borrow. Yeah.
take on debt. So when I start to think about this, right? So I'm like, okay, if consumption's staying high and strong, well then that's good if we're spending if it's coming from our incomes, like we're generating higher incomes, right? The problem is though that credit card debt is at a record high, and credit card balances continue to rise, quarter after quarter. And if you think about that, it's like, well, our credit card interest rates like what, like 1 or 2%? No, I mean, those APRs can be 25 to 30%. And another thing that's interesting to look at is the share of credit card holders who are still making only making their minimum monthly payment is at a record high. So not only do you have these really large credit card balances, but you also have a higher share of people who are just paying the absolute minimum, and that means they're accruing interest at 25% at least. So if you're fueling consumption from debt, that's a different story than fueling consumption from just having higher income, whether it's through investment income or your wages. So that right there for me is not a good sign. I mean, you don't want to, a strong economy, a lot of times in the news they'll say, oh, well, the consumer's staying strong, so the economy's still strong. But it depends on, is that coming from more debt, or, are we actually producing more, getting more, higher incomes and then consuming more that way? Living with more within our means. Investment is not necessarily a good sign if it's going down, because we think of the investment coming from, the firms as that's the investment in, the future growth, the long-term growth, building, investing in infrastructure, whatever it is, from the private sector. Now the government can invest in infrastructure too, but that's all part of the government spending, right? And that again contributes directly to GDP. But again though, that's coming from the public sector. And and as far as when you want to think about how strong an economy is, typically you want to focus more on what's going on from the private sector, because that's when investments coming more out of like earnings and profits, and not just taxpayers. So on the activity side, I look at the actual components, and you can break it down by there, and then of course even then you can start to break it down by like, okay, like which categories within these, like where's all the consumer spending coming from? One of the age groups that is staying strong with spending is like the 25 to 35 age group. This is also the age group that has a high share of individuals living at home still, that aren't homeowners yet. 30 years ago, when you were 25, you were looking at buying homes, but now that's been a decreasing share of the of that group now. Very few homeowners are buying homes in their 20s. And then.
Do you think it's just like kids wanting to save, or do you think it's kids that just don't want to take on that risk of like having to pull out and borrow money?
So that that's a whole other thing. It's a combination of probably a little bit of both. The problem with saving is that now our current generation, until the last couple of years, savings rates have been like basically zero. The only way you could get a return was investing in something that had some risk, right? And that's what eventually we see when that happens. You can see bubbles tend to pop up in certain areas, because it's you're searching for a return. So it's a combination of maybe savings rates are lower. I mean, obviously if credit card debt's rising, we're probably saving less. We did see a tick up in savings when we went into the lockdowns. Because there was nothing really to do. So you might as well just save. But since then, savings rates have been super low. And one thing, this can tie into thinking about inflation, but when it comes to savings, it comes to the real returns. And like let's say you look at an account and it's offering you 4%. That's a nominal return. Now if the inflation rate's 6%, how do you calculate the real return? you take the nominal,
And then
subtract the inflation rate, and then that would give you negative 2%. Now, if you hear a negative interest rate, well, that's not going to encourage saving. That's going to encourage borrowing. Because technically, I mean, in theory, you're getting paid to borrow. Because you're going to pay back, with cheaper dollars in the future. So in real terms, you're actually, in a better position as a borrower.
Isn't that what kind of led to that 2008 recession? Was that all these mortgage companies were like in negative nominal interest rates, and they're having to just fork over to these borrowers?
So that's that was kind of tied into when the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates even more. So rates were they were low in the 2000s, but when we hit the crisis, they lowered even more. But the Fed didn't want to go negative, so they had to keep it above zero. But now inflation back then was also pretty low. So you still real rates, they may have been slightly negative, but they weren't like super negative. But now let's think back to when we had remember inflation hit like 9% back in the summer of 22. And so if you had a 9% inflation rate back then, the Fed wasn't raising, or they just started raising rates maybe. So they were like at 4 something. That's a big negative short-term interest rates. So of course people are going to keep borrowing, and probably you're still not going to get the savings up when the real rate's that low. You need a return to save.
Now, are the short-term interest rates and the long-term interest rates still flipped, or has it been coming back slowly?
Those have started to kind of reinvert. So like basically you had a period where the short-term rates, thinking back to when the Fed was like raised them up to 5.5%. That the short end of the curve was up there, and then the lower end was, or the long end was lower. It was like at 4 something, right? And what that means is that typically you're expecting either lower prices or lower interest rates in the future, or just lower economic growth when that happens. Then because in normal times, the long end of the curve should be higher because if you're going to lend long, you need to be compensated for that extra amount of time. So now we've I think the federal funds rate is what 4.25.
It's
4.5.
4.25, 4.5.
Yeah, so that's the short end, and the long end, like the 10-year, is at like 4.5, 4.6. So it started. It's not like super steep, but it started to reinvert a little bit.
Yeah, because I remember you talking about that in class, and that's like a telltale sign of a recession coming was that invert in the interest rates. Right?
That's right. Yeah, and so like that's one of my favorite indicators is looking at that inversion when you want to try to forecast a recession, because typically before every recession the curve inverts, and then when it starts to it always has to go back to normal at some point. When it starts to reinvert, when it's finally like flat, that's typically happens during the recession. And then by the time it goes back to normal, that's when you're getting out of the recession, and then when it really gets steeper. The recession should be over. I mean, that's typically kind of the cycle. So it inverts before, and then the process of reinverting happens during. I mean, it's never down to the quarter, but that's just kind of the general pattern. So I do like looking at the 2-10 spread, the 2-year and the 10-year treasury spread, and that's where you can kind of monitor that inversion.
So with that logic, do you see a recession coming in the next?
So with the way it's been, I think we've already been in one. Now, of course, the way it works with a recession, there's a technical definition where you have to have, two quarters in a row, consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. Now, that was always the rule for every recession until, the summer of 22, that actually happened. It was like the first 2 quarters, we actually had negative growth, slightly negative. And then the BEA, who actually determines, whether or not we're in a recession, they decided we're going to change this definition because, because the labor market still was doing okay, So now that really isn't the hard rule anymore. Now it's just kind of like this subjective, like you got to have sustained contractions in multiple sectors, and then they'll come out and determine where we're in a recession. But you don't know if you're in a recession or that you were in one until the data comes out months later, because GDP data's lagged. It comes out after like we just got Q4 GDP data, and then that measure is going to still get revised in another month or two. I mean, it could take months to really get the official numbers. So you don't know, it'll be like, oh yeah, by the way, last quarter we were in a recession. So that's how it works, and like I said, when you're, do I think we're in one? Well, I think, we were probably already in one, and we'd have to spend a whole afternoon talking about, how the data that we actually do get reported, like how it has some issues, and what it's actually capturing. But that's a whole nother.
Now, do you think like all these tariff wars are partly to blame for all this, or do you think it kind of happened late, like in the process?
Yeah, so from my experience with news, they love to try to explain everything that happens in the markets with something that's, they try to grab at something, right? So like the latest thing now is because tariffs have been, in the news so much, they like to try to attribute every little downturn, whether it's in the stock market or something, to these tariff threats. In, throughout history, tariffs really haven't had that big of a role. They'll say like, oh, they're going to be inflationary. Certain things, inflation is, sustained price rising across all sectors, right? A 10% tariff on, some goods coming, we do import a lot from China, but not as much as we used to. We still get a lot of our clothes coming from other countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia. So that could be, we might see some prices on some products go up a little bit, but by the time we actually see those prices, it has to get filtered through so many different sectors and companies, and it depends on how tight, the profit margins are. And sometimes, they may just absorb a little bit of that higher price of importing, and we may not even see it. So, there's a lot of uncertainty as far as like, how it will affect our prices. Maybe televisions might, go up a little bit, but how often are we buying a new television? Electronics, a lot of times we'll buy an electronic, we're gonna use it for years. So, it depends on what the products are, how often you're buying them, A lot of the things, we still have, we have agricultural imports coming in from, we get a lot of produce from like Mexico, we get a lot of oil coming in from Canada, but we still produce a lot of that ourselves. The nice thing about like agriculture and oil, we already have the infrastructure set up to still keep growing what we're growing and, producing oil. We can always ramp up a little bit, but it's a lot harder to bring in, new factories to build, like a television. We haven't built televisions in 50 years, so that's a lot tougher. But like I said, you don't buy televisions every day. You buy food and energy every day. So as far as the tariffs, we'll see, a lot of time, right now they're just proposals.
They're just like bickering at each other.
Yeah, and it's like they're kind of using them almost like as threats to get, concessions in other areas, which, who knows what all the concessions they even want, at the end of the day. Maybe we're just going to be in this kind of limbo period for a year where we just throw out, we're going to throw 10% on you, or, maybe, we'll reduce it on oil, but we'll have 25% on the wheat, we may just be doing stuff like that for a while. It's kind of like what happened with Colombia with, the immigration situation down there, and we threatened Colombia with a tariff, and they ended up, accepting some of the migrants that we were trying to, move over there. But it's hard to say. I don't think the tariffs right now is what's going to, if we're in a recession or going into one or already had one, it's not from the tariffs.
That's interesting you say that we may have already passed it, because there's always this topic of soft landing. So could you explain that even to people who are listening about soft landing, and do you think that, like, how does that even work in this situation?
Yeah, so the whole issue is, so when the Fed has to raise rates, right? So when we have that inflation, the Fed has to raise rates. The idea is that when they're going to raise rates to bring down inflation, you have to have a recession of some sort. And the big one that always gets thought about was the inflation in the 70s, and the Federal Reserve back then raised the Federal Reserve rate up to about like 18%. So mortgage rates back then, my parents, they had a mortgage at like 20-something% back in the early 80s. So like historically rates are still super low, right? But there was recessions back then, of course, and the idea is, kind of the way I like to say is that a recession is kind of the cure to a bubble of some sort. When things get too far out of line in one direction, you have to come down. It's like, if you party too hard all night, you're gonna have a hangover. And I kind of think about a recession as like the hangover. That's just the way it goes. Now, as far as the soft versus hard landing, the hard landing, if you think of like, landing in an airplane, if it hits and it's bumpy, and you get jerked a little bit. Well, that's like if we had like a major recession where the unemployment rate shoots up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%, like back in 2008. But a soft landing would be one where maybe the unemployment rate rises just a little bit, but it's overall pretty smooth. But I mean, we basically had a period when we were raising rates, the unemployment rate wasn't going up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when they were even saying like, there's gonna be no landing. Like it's like you just kind of come down and then you just keep gliding at at low altitude. I mean that they started saying that there wasn't even a soft landing. So I mean the whole idea behind that is just when it always happens when we're raising rates to bring down inflation. The question is how much because rates go up, prices come down, unemployment rate is supposed to go up.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not going up much, well then it's basically like not having really a landing at all. So pretty smooth. Now the unemployment rate's been ticking up a little bit lately. But it's still historically pretty low, 4%, but then again there's a lot of nuances with what that unemployment rate means when it really captures.
And the Fed said they weren't raising rates too, correct? Like
yeah, at the last meeting.
Yeah, this past conference that they said they weren't gonna raise it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or were they also weren't gonna lower it though?
Yeah, they weren't gonna lower it. That's
Yeah.
what it was.
So they at the last two meetings they lowered it.
Yeah.
And then as of 3-4 months ago, they were planning for like 5 cuts in 2025. And then, they definitely were thinking that they were going to cut it at the last meeting. They didn't. They held it. And then now I think the markets are pricing in like maybe 2 cuts this year, but if even that.
So why didn't they want to cut it this past?
So it's I think it's the inflation situation.
Okay.
Because the unemployment rate, although it hasn't gone up by much, it's still been, it's going up a little bit. So, that's a little bit of a concern. If the unemployment rate starts to rise, that's when they want to cut rates if that starts rising. But the problem is that, they keep saying that they got that 2% inflation target, and it's been stuck now at like 3%.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been hovering around 3%. And the problem with that though is, like I said, if you keep it, if you kept lowering it, that fuels the inflation problem while keeping the labor market hopefully intact because you keep it cheaper for the firms and to hold on to jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're worried about the inflation. I don't think it's on the path that they want it to be at, and they're concerned that it's going to keep getting higher.
How have like physical and recent monetary policies affected the economic inequality throughout the recent years?
Yeah, okay, so this is, obviously just like all this stuff, there can be a lot of stuff to think about with respect to wealth inequality and everything, but I mean, you basically had a time when, like, a lot of times when we think about wealth inequality, we'll divide it like into the bottom 90% and then the top 10%, right? Yeah. And so basically, like, starting like in the 40s and the 50s, you had the share of the wealth in the U.S. for the top, or the bottom 90%. That was growing. So 40s, 50s, 60s, up to about the late 70s. That was growing. So that was also back in the period when, the middle class was growing. Everyone was able to purchase a home. Yeah. And, you were able to, have family, people were starting families young, 2-3 kids and whatnot. And then that was also still kind of the period too where a lot of times you would just have one income earner in the home. A lot of time, like a husband could generate enough income from one job to support a family. Yeah. And now, I think like probably the early 80s, those started to converge the other way. And basically that share of the U.S. wealth between the bottom 90% and the top 10% converged around like 2010, where it was like even. And then now it's completely gone the other way. So, the thing I try to think about is, interest rates, with monetary policy, they hit a peak in the early 80s. And then ever since then, they started coming down. And then, now, like I said, we're like still record low interest rates. When we keep interest rates low, you want to think about like, who does that benefit, right? It typically is good for stocks, financial portfolios. It can be good for other assets like housing, if you keep the cost of borrowing low. But now you got to think about, okay, now which individuals in society are going to have, access or, have portfolios of stocks and, financial assets, right? Who has real estate? Who's going to benefit off of real estate appreciation and stock appreciation, Yeah. So the problem is that yes, low interest rates can keep borrowing costs, low for, if you need to borrow to buy a car or a home, which can help out everyone. But the problem is that you still need to get a loan from the bank, and you still have to have a good credit score, and all that. So it doesn't really matter, when interest rates are low. And we always, a lot of times we kind of think about like, and I always try to point this out with when we have our textbooks. They'll say, okay, who benefits the most when interest rates are low or even negative, in terms of like borrowers, and they're like, oh well, the debtors, the poor have to take on debt, the poor have to borrow. But when you actually look at who are the biggest debtors and the most leveraged individuals in the world, it's actually the wealthy.
Yeah.
And they have the means and the assets to put up, and to leverage, that wealth to take on more debt to buy more, financial or physical assets. So that's kind of what I think is a big issue that we have is when interest rates are low like that, we tend to help out those who already have the easy access to credit. And so even though the poor may need to borrow, they may not be able to. They may not have a solid enough credit score. They have low credit scores because they can't make their credit card payments. Like the record number of individuals just making their minimum payments right now. So now do I think that's the only thing contributing? No. You can also talk about fiscal policy and taxes and all that. But low interest rates I think definitely are probably not as good as we would think for the middle class and the poor.
Yeah, in labor econ, we were talking about the earned income tax credit and how people are like, I forgot the economist's name, but he did a study on, he taught Fidelity tax professionals about the earned income tax credit, and then he was like, all right, teach your clients about the earned income tax credit and let's see what happens. And they taught him it, and like based on your dependents, it shoots up to like 16,000 or something like that if you have 3 dependents. But only if you work like, I think it's like 8 hours or low hours. Only if you work low hours.
Right.
But once you go above that, like they just cut it off, and they're like, basically they're like, we want you to work more because then you make more and
to incentivize the working,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean when you then that comes under the fiscal policy with taxes, and I mean typically at its most bare bones theory is that if you want less of something, that's when you tax it, right? Like so if you want to import less, you do tariffs, which is a tax, right? That's fiscal policy, it's international fiscal policy. In theory, if you want less people to smoke cigarettes, less smoking, you tax cigarettes. If you want people to drive cars less, we'll raise taxes on gas. The problem though is that when you think about, well, then why do we have an income tax? You don't want to disincentivize people working, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing about tariffs too, which we don't, there's something called it's like a recency bias in economics. We tend to be biased towards what we remember, right? Kind of the more myopic view. But we've only had the income tax, permanently since 1930. And that was also the year the Federal Reserve began. Before that, all the tax revenue was generated from basically tariffs. And so there was the philosophy around tariffs 150 years ago was a lot different than it is now, because we just don't see it as, it's not such an important source of tax revenue. But in the old days, that was it. There was no income tax. And then there was rules where you were allowed to have an income tax to finance like a war during war times, but if it was peace, no income tax, because you don't want to disincentivize work, right? But the problem is now we can't finance the government as large as our current government with only tariff revenue. Back when in the early 1900s, the government was only like 2 to 3% of the economy. Now it's over 30%. So you have to have the income tax to finance that, and we still can't finance it because we still have records amount of national, government debt. So it's still not enough. But I mean, we think about there's been proposals to eliminate taxes on tips, right? Getting rid of the tips tax. And then you think about corporate taxes. They talk about lowering corporate taxes, and I mean again, there's it's kind of like you think about if you go back to principles, when you have a rate, you got to multiply the rate times the total to compute how much revenue you're actually generating, right? So if you raise a tax rate, well, in with demand or the law of demand, you would get less of the quantity,
Mm-hmm.
right? You make something more expensive, you're going to get less. So the rate goes up, but then you don't want that pool that you're taxing to get too small, and then that's when the tax revenue would actually go down. So you kind of they look try to find that happy medium of raising the rate just enough to still generate enough tax revenue, but not too much where it starts going down again. But the hope is that okay, if we lower the tax rate, we could still generate more tax revenue because we would encourage so much more work and job creation that we'd have a bigger pool of income to tax. Even if it's at a lower rate, you get more. So the way I like to think about any tax proposal is just what's it going to do to incentives? What's the purpose? What do you want less of?
I know India just released a new tax code, and it was like it went based on your wealth, so it was like 5, 10, 15, 20, and it seemed like a great proposal. I think they just I don't know how to say it, introduced it to the legislation. So I feel like that would be great.
Yeah, just a tier.
Yeah, it's tier system, 5, 10,
Mm-hmm.
15, just based on your wealth. And I feel like we've complicated it so much, just all the different stuff that there's always going to be that inequality with taxes. You can't really get around that.
Yeah, and and again too, I mean, basically, no matter what tax bracket you're in, you are paying some form of a tax, on your income. And when they first introduced the income tax rate, it was really advertised just as being the top 10, 20, 30, the wealthy. But over time, we had to finance more wars and stuff, and eventually that had to get lowered to lower income groups. But yeah, I mean, at the beginning, it was easier to implement when it was just going to be applied to it, making over a certain threshold. But now, we're all exposed to it.
Yeah, I feel like the middle class really sees it because the upper class, they can donate millions and cut their taxes, write stuff off on businesses, but the middle class really has to take everything passed down that they didn't pay. They have to. Right. It just works its way down the bracket.
And what's unique about income taxes too is you can't avoid it unless you're self-employed and you never actually see that money, right? It's like, if there's a consumption tax, like a tariff, I mean, that's still your money. It's not going to get, or as a firm, you're not going to pay the tax until you actually engage in that activity. Yeah. But when you're working for a company or, someone is paying you your paycheck, the tax comes out before you even see it. So you don't even have the opportunity to try to change your behavior, to try to avoid it. You can't. So that's why, the income taxes are always a little more controversial than sales taxes on, consumption taxes.
Yeah, like even states like Florida, Texas that don't have that, you see the brunt of it in real estate taxes. Yeah. They just move it to a different area.
And the states are always allowed to do what they want with taxes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, before, when we talk about there was no, income tax, that's always at the federal level. But back then, states could still do what they want. If you got an expensive state that it just costs more to, to handle the infrastructure and, then you may have to raise taxes. But then, you still have the choice of where you want to reside and, what state you want to live in, But it's the federal tax that gets the most controversy.
Do you think we have policies right now that address these issues effectively, or what approach do you think policymakers should take?
So going back to the wealth situation, I think a lot about, what's one of the, the biggest asset classes or class that we, in middle class or just, the standard consumer would have access to, and that would be a home, right? And I mean, basically, when you look back from the early 1900s up until really like the 2000s, the cost of housing actually kept up with the inflation rate pretty steady. So the actual real cost of housing was staying pretty steady. It was rising a little bit, but it was really like during the housing bubble when that really started to diverge, and then the house prices just completely, broke loose and rose at a rate faster than inflation. So the real cost really, went up. So when we start thinking about how to make, if that's one of our biggest asset classes for generating wealth or to store wealth, how do we get more homeowners, affording homes at younger ages, and that varies by states, but like I said, now the average age at which the average homeowner in the U.S. is now, it's in their like 30s. It's getting, it's a lot higher than it used to be. Same thing with like getting married and starting families. We're waiting a lot longer, and this is more dramatic in states like California, Florida, and New York that have, that are very expensive property prices. So I started to think about, okay, so what type of policy would promote more affordable housing, and a lot of times we get so focused on subsidizing the buyer, which is good when when prices are so high. There's no one, you have to.
Yeah.
But the problem is what happens when you don't do anything to the supply side and you keep creating more demand? What happens to prices?
Shoot up.
It goes up, and you can start to think about this with education and stuff, and how much the government's involved with the student loan market, right? If you keep enabling more individuals to be able to afford these expensive assets or these expensive services, well, that's just going to keep them being able to charge those higher prices, if not higher.
Yeah.
So I try to think about, okay, maybe instead of addressing the affordable housing situation with focusing on the buyer, what if we focus more on the supply side? What if we somehow gave tax incentives to, these are out there, these are at the state level, we have these, but I think we need a bigger focus on the construction of affordable housing and more homes and less, there's so many, it's at the state level and federal level, we have so many weird zoning laws and regulations that make it very expensive for home developers to develop the affordable housing because those properties are cheaper. So when they have to clear a certain threshold to cover their costs, they're gonna want to build larger homes and more luxury homes. And if you look at the average size of homes that are being built now, they're a lot bigger than they used to be. Now you've got a lot of homes are coming in with 4 bedrooms, 3 baths. Whereas they're bigger in square footage because they need to make them bigger to get a high enough price to cover the cost of building. Because it's like you think of building a home, you got a lot of fixed costs. But once you're going to build a home that's 1,500 square feet, how much more does it really cost to make it 2,000? Maybe a couple extra bedrooms, And then from there, how much more does it cost to make it 2,500 square feet, 3,000? But it can add, you can add 50 grand, 100 grand to the price by building those bigger homes. So, that's another problem, and that keeps the prices bigger, and we need more of the smaller stuff, right? And increase the supply and the principle.
So let's shift gears a little, and how do you think economic principles shape our personal financial and investment decisions?
So obviously, if you go back to, like your first couple weeks of principles, right? You always think about you learn like scarcity, right, and opportunity cost, right? And it's like for every activity or anything you engage in, right? You got to give something up, right? And it can be as simple as just time. It's like if I'm going to spend an extra, hour studying for this exam, that's an hour I'm giving up on watching some Netflix, right? Or maybe you got like a little side hustle you like to do at home, like on the computer. Maybe that you could actually like monetize that time of, that cost of your time. So it goes the same way with thinking about how you want to invest your money and what you want to spend it on. Where else could you spend it? You can either save it, invest it, or but you're going to be giving up some potential opportunity to consume right now, right? And one of the things I like to say is that when it comes to thinking about policies and your decisions, there's no solution. There's only trade-offs. Okay, no matter what we try to fix or whatever you try to improve in your life, you're gonna have to sacrifice something else somewhere. Whether it's actual monetary, time, it can be anything. So thinking about personal finances, the biggest things for me that I have to talk about is okay, well, you got some money you want to do something with, right? And there's different options. Well, if you put your money into a savings account, you need to look at obviously the return you're going to get, and then that your opportunity cost of that is what else you would be generating. So obviously it's if I go and spend $100 right now on some type of consumption item, my opportunity cost of that would have been the 4.5% I could have earned on it by leaving it in my bank for another month at some high yield savings account. So that's one thing. Now another thing you want to think about though too with saving and not spending right now is inflation, right? That's a big one. If prices are rising, do you want to be holding on to money or do you want to get rid of it when things are becoming more expensive?
You want to probably hold on to it or spend it.
Probably spend it, right?
That's something I've always been confused about. Is because prices are rising. Why would you want to go out there and just spend it all?
Right. So think about it like this. So let's say you want to buy a brand new television or a car soon, but you also are confident that the price is going to rise by 10-20% in 6 months or a year.
you're probably going to buy it sooner, right?
Yeah, okay.
So it's kind of like if you think prices are going to be higher in the future, you tend to bring, on average, you want to buy that stuff sooner than later if you can, right? So that's going to influence your spending habits. And the whole idea is that if you're going to save it and not spend it, you got to make sure you're going to be compensated for that inflation, So it's like if prices are if I think prices are going to rise at like 10% over the next year, and I'm only going to get offered my little high yield savings account at lending club's only going to give me 5%. That's not going to do me a whole lot of good. I'd probably rather get rid of that now so I can, if I know there's certain things I'm going to need to buy that are going to be 10% more expensive in a year from now, right? Because I'm only going to grow that money by 5% if I leave it sitting, or so
that makes sense.
I think inflation's, understanding inflation. Again, with that too, it's not just enough to look at what the headline number is, 3% right now. You got to think about what's inflation going on with your own personal expenses. It's like every 6 months, like my auto premium goes up between like 25 to 50%. And then I look at like, okay, where does that fall in the consumer basket of goods? The CPI, and like auto insurance, it makes up like 2%. So it's like I got something that just went up by like 50% one year. But it's only a 2% little wedge in the basket, so it doesn't, it's very little impact. So, everyone's inflation experience is going to be different. And then, of course, you can even tie that into the wealth situation. Who do you think is going to be hit the hardest by inflation? What individuals, Well, those who are going to be, have a larger chunk of their paycheck that is exposed to the things that are rising, like food prices and utility prices,
Middle class, lower class.
Yeah, when you're the wealthy, that's only maybe 20-25% of your budget, 30, depending on what you're buying, But if it's 70-80% of your budget, depending on your wealth situation, well, then that's going to, inflation is going to really suck.
What are some of your personal investments that you got going on right now?
Yeah, so I do. Okay, so I'm not a huge player with stocks. I have some exposure in some, investment accounts, but within stocks, I like some of the stuff that's more tied to like mining stocks, things that are tied to commodities, utilities. I like those. Tech, yeah, but my background is not tech enough to really be able to explain the fundamentals. And personally, I like to try to explain the fundamentals of what I'm investing in.
Yeah.
So, I don't have any exposure to crypto. But, it's worked out great for a lot of investors.
Yeah, it has.
Right now, like when we, 2 years ago, when we raised rates up to, over 5%, I was just putting basically all my savings into treasury bills 1 month. Because 1 month treasury bills were given 5.5%. That's risk free. And then my other, and then the account I was using to move that in and out of was just a high yield savings account online from an online lender, because those are, FDIC insured up to $250,000. Now of course I have my own thoughts on how I feel about insuring deposits, but hey, if the service is there, take advantage of it. That's the whole point. So I'm very risk averse. So I like just getting, I'm still getting 4.5% right now with a high yield savings account, and that's higher than the current federal funds rate, which is like 4.25, 4.3. So I'm still leaving a lot there. Now, a lot of guys will, or guys and girls will want to invest in stocks to get, higher returns, and that's totally fine. But there's still a lot more risk there, And if you start trying to, do the whole picking and choosing and moving stuff out of different, sectors, you can do that, and it might work 1 year, couple years in a row, but then all it takes is one really big down year to wipe out 3-4 great years of returns. Whereas I'd rather just kind of keep things nice, slow and steady. Yeah, so right now that the 1 month treasury bill is like 4.25, I'm actually not investing in that right now because I'm getting 4.5 still on my savings account. So I just monitor those.
Yeah. Switch back and
it's
forth.
risk free.
Yeah.
And then now it depends also how soon you need access to your money. When we you have an investment stock portfolio, your wealth rises with the value of your portfolio, but that's still not realized income or anything. And if you actually want to use that and buy something with it, you have to pull that money out. And that's what I like about having a savings account is you can get that money out within a day if you need to, and if you're saving up for like a down payment or something, it's nice to have that liquidity. At the short term level like that.
Wow.
So I mean, there's all kinds of different stuff. But yeah, personally, I like thinking more fundamentals. I still like even thinking about investing in commodities. I mean, no matter what, there's always going to be a physical need and demand for metals and food and energy. That's not going away anytime soon. We're not, we can move towards going electric, but we're going to be on fuel probably for the rest of our lifetimes. We're not going to see it change that.
That's something Michael Puckett was saying last night in our talk, was that, and I think it was his first hedge fund. They would just trade commodities because that was just like the best thing going on. And he had read this book called like Return Expectation, or he was talking about it, and he said that like if a commodity is going up for 3 months, buy. And that's he was just like,
yep, that's right.
You should always buy it if it's going up for 3 months.
Well, yeah, and another thing you can think about that too is that a lot of commodities are inputs into production processes, right? So if one of the actually early indicators of higher prices can be watching commodity indices. So if you start seeing a commodity index rising, that can typically start to happen before we see the consumer. The last thing to rise are the consumer prices. And like I said, there's so many channels that things have to go through, but a lot of times it can start at the commodity prices, and then that filters into the producer price index. If the firm's input costs are starting to rise, the producers, well, then that can happen a little before they raise the retail prices. So those are definitely things you could start to look at. And another thing too is that you can look at the producer prices in other countries that we import things from. If you want to think about our import prices, what's going on with inflation in China and Bangladesh, Indonesia, and stuff like that. If they're going to start having to raise prices, well, then that's going to eventually filter into our imports. I mean, we import something like 90% of our clothing now.
Yeah, from Eastern Asian countries.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, there's certain things like we literally don't produce any of anymore. Like just certain very, very basic products, like zero.
Did the talk last night kind of open your eyes to like maybe compounding in your own like investment journey? Like,
yeah, well, I mean, it mainly just got me thinking about what like what I'm doing with my own current savings. And as soon as you have a chunk of money, and the idea too is to add to it each month, but at least be able to leave something in there untouched, right? Michael's right definitely about having an emergency fund. You always want to have an emergency fund, but there's nothing wrong with having that in something that you can get a little bit of a return on. Now, of course, for me personally, I wouldn't want to have that in any account that could theoretically go to zero. Right? Yeah. And that's why, personally, like why I like, if I am going to do some stock investments, I like doing something that is tied to utilities or something that's tied to mining and metals, because I am basically almost 100% confident that those values of those commodities will never go to zero. It just won't.
Yeah, because they're inputs. Like.
Yeah, I mean, technically, oil futures did go negative back in COVID, but I mean, that was such a crazy period, of government policy and monetary.
It's hard.
That's a black swan for sure, but commodity prices still, metals still never went negative. That's all going to have value. But in theory, anything digital, any digital assets could, theoretically, go to zero.
Do you think that could happen with like crypto and all these coins that aren't like backed by like really anything? It's just like speculation, pretty much.
Yeah. So I mean, what I've heard about, what I've read is that there is some fundamentals to it as far as the blockchain technology goes. I can't explain it. I don't understand it. Now I know there's definitely like some good books out there, or if you can spend some time and dig deep, and then you might be sold on that idea. But the guys who are very hard hardliners on crypto, and it's mainly Bitcoin. It's like they are investing in just the prospects of this blockchain technology, and they believe that it can't be eliminated as long as it's still like decentralized, right? And then that's where things can get kind of scary when the government start talking about getting more involved, because the big pros of those markets is the decentralized nature, right? But we're still not transacting in Bitcoin. We had the country, what was the Central America country was it El Salvador? Or?
Yeah, I think El Salvador.
Yeah, so they made it a legalized national currency, still alongside their own currency, which I think they're on the dollar now, I want to say. But if you go down there and visit, a lot of the vendors don't accept Bitcoin because they can't afford the infrastructure to take payment with it.
Yeah.
You know, you gotta digitize your whole, you know, your payment system. And a lot of times they're still just transacting in currency, even though it's the national currency. You know, or it's tender, legalized tender. So I think we're still a long ways away from it being, you know, a payment system. You know, but like I said, you know, that, I mean, there's other fundamentals out there that can be explained and that people are very bullish on. But for me personally, if I can't really explain it, then I'm not going to feel confident.
Yeah, all I know like about Bitcoin is that like I know that like underground like, you know, drug cartels and gangs and stuff, they use Bitcoin because it's encrypted and it's you can't trace it. So I mean, that's like a big market for them, is that they just go crypto because they can't be traced. Nothing's physical.
Yeah. And then again, you know, that comes the threat of, you know, more government intervention would kind of, you know, potentially try to eliminate that. Yeah, you know, and another thing too that doesn't help is, you know, you get all these meme coins. Right? And that can kind of erode some of the confidence in or the legitimacy of the real ones, you know, like Ethereum and Litecoin, you know, those. So, you know, it's just such a weird world, and it's still super new, you know. I mean, it's still relatively brand new in the scheme of, you know, monetary history. You know, it's just so early. So right now, I mean, it's just a lot of speculation, and it behaves like a speculative asset. You know, anything that can lose, you know, $10,000 worth in a matter of hours or minutes is speculatory.
That's what like on Twitter and stuff, you see like all these like influencers and stuff that create these meme coins, and then they'll pump it up, and then all of a sudden they just sell everything and it just tanks all the way down.
That's right.
Basically just pumping up the coin and then just taking everything out.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, at the same time, it's not like this is some like big tech CEO like Elon Musk doing this. I mean, it's, you know, it's talk to a girl.
Hey,
you know what I mean?
I think Elon.
It's a girl on social media.
I think Elon manipulates the market though.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the whole thing, you know, and you know, with social media now, there's a lot of financial influencing happening now that didn't used to. You know, in the early social media days, it was really just social, but now, I mean, there's so much business.
That's where you're getting history news nowadays too. On social media and like it's kind of like how the Fed, when they word certain things, like it could change consumers like spending or something like that. How they word it, like these influencers could just word it that way and be like, you know, buy this. Like
with forward guidance, where they say we're gonna raise interest rates in 6 months. The markets react now, and then 6 months from now they actually don't even need to raise it because the market's already reacted to it.
Power of social media.
That's right.
So we'd like to wrap up our interviews with a few fun, rapid questions.
Oh, nice.
Are you ready?
Oh yeah.
All right. If you weren't an economist, what career would you be pursuing?
That's a good question. You know, the first job I ever wanted to do was a police officer.
Really?
When I was in elementary school. Yeah. I actually came across this recently when I was home for Christmas, and I was at, you know, my parents' house, and I made this like little it was like a little paper mache box, and we had to answer questions like on each side of it, and then there was a photo of ourselves, you know. So this was like in first grade, and it said, what do I want to be when I grow up? And it said police officer, and it said so I can put all the bad guys in jail. So that was what I used to be, and then you know, currently now, like thinking right now realistically, I'd probably be doing something in finance, just because I'm still, you know, I still have, that's kind of where my interests are. You know, I mean, you know, economically speaking, my research has kind of been where macro meets finance. But I'd probably be doing something in the financial sector world. I don't know if I would be, I don't know, I like housing markets a lot. Maybe real estate finance. I think it's cool to be able to come up with creative ways to get people into homes. But again, you know, that's a lot of that is on the financing the buyer side, you know. Now, you know, if I was in politics, I would like to focus more on, you know, like supply side issues, which would be cool. But yeah, I mean, something financial related for sure.
A book or podcast you would recommend related to economics?
For what's that?
A favorite book or podcast?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, man, as far as podcasts, my favorite podcaster is probably, I have a few, but I would probably say Peter Schiff. I like Peter Schiff because he's kind of more of like a libertarian when it comes to like free markets. Now he's a little too much free market, you know, whereas I'm definitely pro free markets for sure, but not quite like just freeing up everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he he'll dig. What's cool about him though is that he doesn't just focus on the finance and economics. He'll bring in some political, social issues into it as well.
Yeah.
And he'll say like, hey, if you want to reduce the costs of drug and actual drug use, legalize drugs.
Yeah.
And there have been situations when things when we have cracked like the war on drugs, when you actually look at the amount of drug related deaths and illegal drug use, well, it actually rises the more you try to crack down on it. I mean, certain patterns like that. So he's like, just free it up, let it be legal. And then it's like just because if all of a sudden cocaine's legal and fentanyl and heroin's legal, I'm gonna go also, hey, it's legal now I can go use it, this is awesome. That's not gonna happen, right? So I think he's kind of cool with bringing in those discussions too. I mean, it's a lot of stuff just to kind of think about, but it is like weird ways. It's like even thinking about things like the safety for women with like prostitution. It's like prostitution's illegal, but it's still there. And maybe we would actually make it safer and healthier for women if there was some type of legal authority to help them, keep doing that, because it's going to be there and it's not going to go away.
No, it's
right?
been going on for thousands.
And the problem with an industry like that is there's nowhere to seek legal help if there's an issue.
Yeah. If you could have a dinner with any economist, who would it be and why, dead or alive?
I'd say Milton Friedman. He was the big monetary theory guy. Back, really big back in the 20s. You guys remember the quantity theory of money, where you connect the growth of the money supply to inflation.
Yeah.
So that kind of came all from his theory. I still think the money supply and the monetary policy plays a very big role in our economics. And I mean, obviously we kind of admit it with how much, how importance we give to the Federal Reserve, right? So, but he was one of the earliest, economists to really say, hey, our price problem, it's coming from the money supply.
Yeah.
Too many dollars chasing too few goods, And back in the old days, before the financialization and how easy it was to buy and sell stocks and all that, there was a very close connection to the growth of the money supply and the growth of prices in the economy. And we also weren't as globalized. We weren't importing so much. So a lot of the times those dollars in the economy would stay within the US. And that's why there was a closer connection between US money supply and US prices. But now, like, we can send dollars anywhere. So like, just because if we increase the money supply by 100%, we're not going to see prices in the US rise by 100, because we could be sinking that into markets over in India or China or Africa. So like, if you really try to connect the amount of dollars chasing goods and try to connect the price level to that, if you too many dollars, prices rise if there's not enough goods. Well, if you spread out those dollars all over the world, that's a lot of goods for it to cover, right? And then you've got other markets too where inflation could hide in, like real estate prices, stock markets. A lot of money goes into the stock market. That's been rising consistently. So there's just a lot of places where the money supply can hide now than it used to. And that's why we see that disconnect now between money supply growth and prices. They don't really move together anymore.
Yeah, and also devalue the money too.
That's right.
And we're seeing like the BRICS over in the Middle East area and all that. They're starting to come together to put together their own currency. I don't know what they're gonna use yet. I think it might be yen.
There's rumors that it could be like a basket of commodities that would back it.
Like oil or...
Yeah, there could be, oil, but the idea is that it's going to be backed by a basket of things that are physical, commodities. So minerals, oil, maybe certain, tied to claims to futures of agriculture, who knows. But it would be like a real backing. But, then again, that stuff takes decades and decades. And, the dollar will be the reserve currency for still many, many years. But, it's the trends. It is important to follow the trends. And, we do see some countries starting to use dollars a little bit less. Like the Middle East, they'll accept Chinese yuan now for oil payments. Nothing was ever, signed into contract that they had to only accept dollars. That was all just verbal agreements back in the 70s. Yeah. So, there's nothing that forces the world to use dollars. And we're still, it still is right now the safest return. And you look at other countries right now, and their economies a lot of countries are still struggling. Europe's in a recession,
Yep.
the Eurozone.
So
Canada may be in a recession. They got like 7.5% unemployment right now. You know, so if you've got other countries that are weak, I mean, we could be weak, but if we're just a little less weak, then we're the strongest.
yeah.
And that's still going to, everyone's still going to want to hold the currency of the strongest economy in the world.
Yeah, I think it's just like crazy to think that like if we take one of our dollars to like say like South American country with like really high inflation or something like that, like we could buy like pretty much a house with a $20 bill.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's just crazy to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you can go and stay on a beachside resort like in Thailand
Yeah.
for $20 a night.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's
You
just
know?
like-
And that can include food too. And you know, a lot of times in these other countries, you know what they do is they get paid in their local currency, you know, their paycheck. But then they will have a dollar denominated checking account that sits right alongside their local currency checking. And they will immediately transfer their salary
to
into the
America.
dollar denominated account.
Mhm.
So if their currencies losing value to like inflation, you know, you look at countries like Turkey, Venezuela, Argentina, some of these inflation rates are like up near 100%.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to want to sit there with Argentinian pesos sitting in your checking account that earns 0%
Yeah.
when you could at least put it into a dollar denominated account that still doesn't get a return, but at least it's not going to lose value. You know, and a lot of times those countries will also, if you go to a restaurant or a store, they will accept, local vendors will accept US dollars instead of Turkish lira. They'll take it because it saves them the extra step of having to take the lira and get dollars.
Yeah, I think
Do the conversion.
I looked up like what like the value of like a Colombian peso was, and it was like 0.000000 like 1.
Oh yeah.
And I was just like, oh my gosh. Like,
Yeah.
You need like 1,000 of those for like $1.
Oh yeah, it's insane.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of times when countries get really, bad inflationary situations, they sometimes just have to abandon their currency and start using something like the dollar. And that's what's called dollarizing. And some countries do accept the dollar as like their main national currency.
I saw like a video on social media of like people literally just taking the pesos and just like making stuff out of them because they were worth nothing. I was just like, goodness, like that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, that's like
Crazy thing.
Germany back in after World War One. They had to pay
Yeah.
all those war reparations. And there's photos of like children flying kites that were made out of the German marks
Yeah.
because they were worth nothing. People were using the German marks as wallpaper because it was easier than going to the store and bringing in a wheelbarrow full of them to buy, because there was nothing was digital. You had to pay with physical currency back then. Or
had so much of those marks just sitting in a big old room.
yeah, to pay toilet paper. It's basically. But then they eventually had to completely switch their whole currency, and that came in the 30s with the whole and then the whole Nazi regime that started with a new currency too in the 30s.
What's the one macroeconomic principle you think everyone should know, no matter what their background is?
Man, well, there's so many.
Just
I think, for me personally, always thinking in terms of real terms, real goods and services. Don't get so caught up in thinking. A lot of times we hear numbers like retail sales are up 50%. That's nominal. It depends on the actual quantity, the volume. Are we actually buying more goods and services? If I get a 10% raise this year, is that good? Well, it's only good if my cost of living didn't go up by more than 10%, right? So I think trying to connect back to real terms, because we always think, oh yeah, that's great, I can get a 5% return. Not if inflation's 9%. That's not good. So I think always trying to just go back to real. Am I actually better off? Is my purchasing power? Can I afford more goods and services than I did a year ago? And then that's how you can determine, whether, that can influence your investing or, your career, your jobs, how you want to go to the bargaining table with your employer. That's all very important. It's like, hey, my cost of living, I don't care if they're saying inflation's 3%, I'm paying 9% more this year. I need a raise, or I'm gonna, I'm gonna go over and, work at McDonald's in California, who are paying $20 an hour.
I saw that.
Fast food minimum wage.
wow.
Being from California, do you think the fires are going to affect the economy at all in California?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that it affects economically over there is just insurance. I grew up in Northern California, and they have just as big of a fire situation as Southern.
Yeah.
But we just hear more about LA because it's such a commercialized area, and the properties that are getting burnt down are like multi-million-dollar homes. A lot of times in Northern California, there's so much more space out there that the fires just burn and, just wilderness.
It's natural.
Yeah, which still isn't great. And they still lose a lot of homes, but you just, it's not as economically damaging as it is when it rips through a city. So yeah, the cost, I mean, the biggest thing for, when it comes to having to rebuild and stuff is the cost of lumber and all that. And that's not going to be based upon a fire, fires in, a state like California. But I think the insurance is the biggest one. So, yeah, it was already hard getting fire insurance in certain areas there. Insurers were already pulling out. And, the government, California had stepped in and actually made it illegal. They introduced some regulations around which companies were able to pull out or in which areas. And the problem is again, that gets involved with the private sector. And, it's a risk. They're running a risk model, and they do their risk assessment. And if the risk is too high, they don't want to do business there. It's like thinking of flood insurance in Florida. It's very expensive. If you live near any river out here, you have to pay flood insurance in Jackson, Mississippi, because in theory you could get a huge rain and it can flood your yard and your home. So I think insurance is the biggest one. That's like the direct impact of that. But that's always going to be there, And the problem with insurers, even in healthcare and health insurance, the insurers' margins are not that big. Maybe you can argue the pharmaceutical companies, making the drugs, they might have bigger margins, but the actual insurance companies, they have pretty tight margins. So if their costs are going up, if the cost of rebuilding the home is going up with lumber or whatnot, they're going to have to raise your insurance.
Or just pull out.
Yeah. Again, that goes back to looking at commodity prices, If those start going up, that ties directly into insurance markets, the cost of rebuilding and repair, replacement.
Before we finally wrap up, actually, but you had a research publication recently, which is a big deal. So we just want to talk about it real quick. Tell us some more and what inspired you to do that, actually.
Yeah. So the paper that I got, it's in a journal called Economic Dynamics and Control. It's kind of more of a macro-focused journal, but they publish a lot of theory and empirical papers. But this project that this paper I got published, it did a little bit of both. And basically it was involved in looking at credit card and small business lending by banks. And the theoretical side of it was, basically there was this, just to give you a quick synopsis. There's this thing called the bank lending channel of monetary policy. So the idea is that when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, how does that influence bank lending? And in theory, all the old theories for this, this channel was that when interest rates go up, it makes it more expensive for banks to get reserves and cash and raise funds, so they're going to lend less, right? They have to get money to lend. Well, in modern times, that relationship is a bit broken because you don't really need physical cash anymore or all those reserves to lend. It's all digital now. And, as long as you have enough on, reserves at the 10% or whatnot. But anyhow, a lot of times when you look at the data, bank lending sometimes would increase. When interest rates would go up, you'd actually see an increase in lending. So that would be against the standard theory, right? The traditional theory. So I created a little model that could explain this, positive relationship between higher interest rates and bank lending going through credit cards and through small business loans. And the idea was the channel at which I generated that relationship was through the lending limits, or like the limit on your credit card. And the idea here was that, think about it like this. You got a credit card, it's got a limit of, $6,000, right? Well, when you're borrowing, the bank makes profits off of potential interest and all that if you're, leaving a balance over. Well, when interest rates go up, and that's going to raise their costs, theoretically, they're going to have an incentive to want to maybe, let's say you're borrowing right up to your limit, well, if they can raise your limit, you're going to borrow more. And that's going to be a bigger principal for them to charge interest on, and therefore increase their revenue that way. So there was the mechanism through which I got that positive relationship was through an increase in credit card limits, as well as like the unsecured limits like on small business loans. But I basically just focused on those categories. So I did some empirical work with seeing it in the data with credit card lending. And then I also created the theoretical model. And at the very end, I calibrated my model using the actual data to try to display the dynamics and see what my model could predict. And, in general, it could kind of match some of the patterns in the data. It was just a general relationship, nothing, one for one.
What was your model that you used?
So it's the area of that research falls under what's called monetary search theory. And basically the idea is that you have these models that focus on the bargaining process between, let's say, like a borrower going up to the bank and they bargain over the terms of the interest rate and all that. And the whole premise of which these models are built upon is the idea that money is not, you do not derive utility from having money, you derive utility from the things you can get with your money.
Well, no,
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like there's these other models that put money directly into the utility function, and the monetary research theorists hate that, because the idea is like, no, I don't get pleasure from just having cash. I get pleasure from the things that the cash gets me, right? I mean, you might feel good when you see the cash in your account, but the true consumption, you know, what makes us better off is the real goods and services that we are able to obtain from our cash. So that's kind of what these models are built upon. You have cash, it's more of just an asset or a means at which you use to, you know, buy a home, you know, buy other assets and goods.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
We just want to say thank you to Dr. Littlejohn for coming here and speaking with us. It was awesome, very informative. And then we want to thank you to our listeners that are listening in today. And until next time, stay curious, invest.